I have a story to share with you all today. A story that has been told and retold for thousands, probably 2,000 years. It is called a poetic masterpiece. It is much more than just a hymn. It is an epic. And it was recited by bards in the pre-Islamic Iranian world. A version of it was also written down in the Acts of Thomas, which was the 3rd century New Testament Apocrypha. So in other words, this is a story that got around and around and around, one that you would have known had you lived then. It is called the Hymn of the Pearl. In its essence, it is the story about the journey of a soul. That soul was given a mission by its divine parents. And the soul was then incarnated into human society as a child. And so as that child grows into an adult, she tries to fit in, taking on new identities. He tries to follow the rules, desiring acceptance, and then begins to follow the ways of prejudice and greed, indifference and short-sightedness. In so doing, the bards tell us that one veil after another is placed over the person's eyes, blinding him until the soul within has forgotten itself and its mission. It says, I became what they wanted me to become, and I forgot myself. I wonder if any of us have woken up one morning and wondered, what have I become? How did I get here? Who on earth am I? I often think that the story of the Hymn of the Pearl is the ancient story of a midlife crisis. Who are we? Mysticism within every religious tradition is an invitation to wake up. And I invite you not to fall asleep during this sermon. To wake up, whether due to a life event, like a midlife crisis, like the death of a loved one, or through spiritual practices, through meditation, through dances, through however it is that you remind yourself of the best in yourself. It is the realization that life has a deeper meaning, it has a deeper purpose, it has a deeper connection than we can currently see. Many religions will focus on what we attain in the afterlife. It is said that that will be when our souls will commune with God, when we will be one with the larger love. Mysticism says we don't have to wait, that joy in its fullest form is available to us now. We just can't see it. And so the mystics invite us to take off the veils that blind us, to wake up. These veils remind me of Brené Brown's research on human shame and vulnerability. She writes in her book, Daring Greatly, the word persona is the Greek term for stage mask. And in my work, masks and armor are the perfect metaphors how we protect ourselves from the discomfort of vulnerability. Masks make us feel safer, even when they become suffocating. Armor makes us feel stronger, even when we grow weary from dragging the extra weight around with us. We wear masks in order to fit in order to be accepted. But the consequence of that is that we hide ourselves from the world, but also from knowing who we actually are. Of course, the call of mysticism is to take off those masks. And I don't know if you heard it 2 weeks ago as we delved into humanism and heard the words of James Baldwin when he said, love takes off masks that we fear we cannot live without, but that we know we cannot live within. So each of us has this pearl within us, says mysticism. Some of us might call it God, but others of us call it an authentic voice, the wisdom that is a part of us. The Unitarians called it that divine spark. That pearl is inherently connected. It's not alone inside you. It is connected to the web of existence, to the larger energy, to that oneness that many call God. I found it encouraging to find Brené Brown's prayer. She says, "Give me the courage to show up and let myself be seen." Do you think you can say that with me? I'm going to feed it out to you and repeat after me. Give me the courage.
Give me the courage
to show up.
To show up.
And let myself be seen.
And let myself be seen.
I see you. And I'm glad you showed up today. But I want to know, have you forgotten the pearl within you? I have to tell you that I know I have, time and time again. Though I've broken my vows 1,000 times. For me, the mystical practices are a remedy against one particular thing that I feel like we struggle with in this time, and that is disengagement. That is our ability to not care what happens, our ability to fall into despair. Brené Brown calls our disengagement a betrayal of trust. Last week's events in Charlotte were a pearl moment for me. On Saturday, I caught glimpses of the news, but I have to tell you that I didn't feel the shock or the surprise or the outrage, even though the actions and the voices and the signs were reprehensible. I didn't feel any of those things. All I felt was resigned, completely disengaged, as if these events were inevitable and we just might as well sit back and watch. That was a form of disengagement. It was a veil over my eyes and probably more likely my heart, and it was a betrayal of trust in me to remember love. As I spoke with others throughout the course of the week, I heard that same sense of despair in times, a yearning, too, for an awakening in this moment. So I can't tell you how grateful I felt for my colleagues like Robin, who got up on Sunday morning and called us back to awakening. For all of you who came out on Monday night here in Summit, who showed up and remind us of the best in ourselves. That was a pearl moment. That was a waking up. It's easy to fall asleep. It's hard to wake up. But I think that that's what we do here on Sundays, each and every Sunday. That's what we do in our small groups. We reconnect with the pearl within, not only ourselves, but one another. And we wake up to what our lives are. The Sufi poet Rumi says, out beyond the ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I will meet you there. And I have to say that on Sunday morning, this is the field. And together, we are meeting. Yet I have also wondered whether if this is a place where we can bring all parts of ourselves. I've wondered about that. I heard a story recently from Reverend Tom Belote, one of our colleagues in North Carolina. He shared an interaction he had with a member of his congregation. You see, he was teaching a course on mysticism, inviting people to read different mystical texts like the poetry of Rumi and to react to them. And one day after class, a woman approached him privately, making sure that no other people were around, because she had a secret she wanted to share. She told him about a time that she had been on retreat. She had taken a walk through the woods when suddenly she became paralyzed throughout her entire body. Yet she was not afraid. In fact, she experienced pleasure as energy coursed through her body. And as suddenly as it came, it left. She wasn't sure how long it lasted, but she felt like it had happened out of time. Now, the woman told him this, and then she looked him square in the eye and said with emphasis that no, she was not suffering from mental illness. No, she did not have a brain tumor, and no, she wasn't on any hallucinogenic drugs. You don't have to show your hands, but I have to tell you, I had a moment where I thought, what was she doing out in the woods? It's hard not to. And Reverend Belote writes, what actually happened? Because that's the question we want to answer. But for this woman, it didn't bother her to answer that question. It was a mystical experience. She was also reluctant to speak about it openly. She didn't want to be judged or ridiculed. And I don't think that we would, but I also hear that she didn't want others to attempt to explain away her experience or to deny that it had happened to her. So she never told another living soul. She closeted herself. And this is a place where we ask you to bring your full self. At the same time that she never told anybody, she also really yearned to process how the experience had awakened her in new ways and what ongoing meaning it might have for her life. Reverend Belote says, one doesn't simply experience this and then go about life in the usual way. So what did it mean? And what sort of change ought to come from such an experience? Ralph Waldo Emerson, the 19th century writer and Unitarian minister, sought out such mystical experiences. He often wrote about seeking a visit from the high muse. I love thinking about that. In order to experience being one with the divine, he would seek it out, of meeting his soul. In your orders of service, you'll see some of his poetry, his quotes, his writings, saying, standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part and parcel of God. Emerson was convinced that everyone can name an extraordinary experience in their lives. He points to the mystical experiences, both the ones that come unbidden, like a midlife crisis, but also the ones that you seek through spiritual practices. And when it happens, it changes you. He said, every person has one or two moments of extraordinary experience, which he never or she never afterward forgot, and which revised all speech and molded all forms of future thought. The transcendentalists of which Emerson was a part used these life-changing experiences to really change America. They built intellectual and literary movements. They brought an interfaith movement to American shores, sharing religious texts related to Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam that had never been here before. They were abolitionists and feminists and social reformers in education, in hospitals, in prisons. It has been argued that their actions were fueled by these mystical experiences of oneness and a deeper sense of purpose in the world. It makes me wonder, how are we closeting our own experiences, our own voices? And how would the world be different if we made meaning out of them? Unitarian Universalism seeks to hold the wide diversity that is the human experiences. Our sources uphold the rational and the scientific while also upholding the direct experiences of transcending wonder and mystery. One of the people that I have long admired is our member, Andre Bernard. He has humbly served our congregation in lots of different ways, but I don't think you know some of the mystical practices, the stories of his mystical practices. And I thought maybe that might be a story we all need to hear. And so I asked, and he was courageous enough to say yes. May we and may Andre this day have the courage to show up and to let ourselves be seen.
So folks, hello. My name is Andre, and I want to thank Reverend Emily for inviting me to participate in this service. Not something I would normally ask to do, but her prodding, her urging was good. So I'm grateful to be here, and I want to thank you, Emily. So a little bit about the path of mysticism that I've been on, or my attempt to be on the path of mysticism. Let me begin by saying, I do lead the Dances of Universal Peace. I do consider myself a Sufi, although when I first, years ago when I was young and I met someone who had been on the path for quite a while, and I said to him, I'm a Sufi. And he said, well, not really. You're an aspiring Sufi. In other words, the connotation of being a Sufi or being a mystic is that you've arrived at a certain station or a certain place in your life. So when I talk today, it's all about the striving, the seeking, being on the path of a mystic. Okay? Just so we got that. I'm not claiming to be in that state continually. Anyway, when you take your first steps on the path of mysticism, you hear invitations in the poetry, in the chants, in the songs, in the wisdom teachings and meditations, and in the walks in nature. Invitations to knock on the door, to open the window, to strip off old garments, and most importantly, to connect to yourself and others with and from the heart. Many of you know that I lead the Dances of Universal Peace. When I went to my first Dances of Universal Peace in 1974, some part of me was touched and opened. My heart center was activated, opened in a way that it had never been. And this part, Emily, again, has urged me to say a little bit about my background, so bear with me. What led me to that door? What led me to the place of seeking? My religious background of my family is this. My father was an Ashkenazi Jew from Poland. His family was quite Orthodox, and he rebelled against the orthodoxy of Judaism, the orthodoxy of his family. When he was young, his family moved to Egypt. Later on in life, he met my mother, who was a Sephardic Jew, and they were married, and this was considered an intermarriage, and not something that was appreciated, shall we say, by the families. It was considered like an intermarriage. The Sephardics and the Ashkenazis were, two different cultures, almost two different races. But my parents got married, the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic. And then in 1952, when things started to get difficult in Egypt for the Jews had been in Egypt for centuries and been a thriving community. 1952, things started to shift, and my family left, and we left in a hurry. And first we went to England, we stayed there a few months, then we moved to Canada for a couple of years, and then finally in 1955 we immigrated to the United States. And I grew up in New York City, and you could say that my upbringing was commonly referred to as the upbringing of a secular Jew. I had very little religious training. Then fast forward to the heart of the rebellious 1960s and 1970s. I attended Columbia University in the late 60s and early 70s, and if you remember a little bit about that time, it was a tumultuous time. It was the birth of what is commonly called the counterculture, and I found myself rejecting the materialism that was and is so prevalent in our culture. Soon after graduating, I didn't know what I was supposed to do and what my purpose was. And I wound up taking a year abroad, traveling through Europe, East Africa, and Israel, and being exposed to a world of different sights, sensations, and experiences. And when I came back, I was still not clear on what was next, and I wound up traveling across the country. And then I visited a friend in Eugene, Oregon, who brought me to my first meeting of the Dances of Universal Peace. At that time, they were called Sufi dances, 1974. So when I went to my first Dances of Universal Peace in 1974, something happened on several levels in my being. Some part of me was touched and opened. My heart center was activated and opened in a way that I had never been. Whether I knew it or not, I was seeking an experience outside of dogma or institution that would connect or reconnect me with my own authenticity and something larger than myself. And at the same time, that would teach me how to live in this world. What I discovered through the dances and walking practices and through other related practices were experiences that were indeed a doorway. A doorway to creating meaning and sense in my life, and of joining with others on this path. I felt a sense of community or Sangha. The Dances of Universal Peace are a practice that are an embodied experience. The seemingly simple act of just holding hands in a circle, which in and of itself is sacred and timeless, is just the beginning of the practice. Then we add chanting of a sacred phrase or song, breathing, movement, dance. You are knocking on a door and seeking and seeing what opens within you. We do many partner dances, and in the partner dances you are eye to eye, face to face, heart to heart with another. For many, it gives them a direct experience of the divine in oneself and the divine in someone else, the divine in the other. And all the while, at the same time, we get glimpses of a deeper joy, even ecstasy. Over the years, and in combination with other practices, an awareness of the self and others is cultivated. As a Unitarian Universalist for about 15 years, I know that many of us have a complicated relationship with the divine, with even the word itself, God. So how is God viewed within mysticism, specifically within Sufism? Now, all the while, you have to realize that this is something that is nearly impossible for words to describe. Mystics acknowledge that God is beyond defining. But anyway, I'll just say a few things about it. In Sufism, we often say that God is your lover and not your jailer. God is your lover and not your jailer. This is one reason why Rumi uses the word beloved so often in his poetry to describe the holy. Many understand it as the direct experience of unconditional love. It is the experience of compassion and connection. It is reclaiming our birthright to be one with the beloved. Many of us feel that God is far away, distant, or that God has even abandoned us. In Sufism, quite the opposite. It is said that God is within. God is closer than your jugular vein. There is a dropping away of the distinction of lover and beloved. Mystics use practices to experience both authenticity and universal unconditional love. Love for themselves and love for others. It is there that God, or the divine, or whatever you'd like to call it, resides. Through practices, we aim to be centered and quiet inside, in a state that cannot be shaken by external circumstances. In time, this leads to a sense of strength and inner security. A centeredness and strength that you can call on in times of difficulty and stress. This does not mean that there is an avoidance of difficulty or suffering, because who can totally avoid difficulty and suffering in life? But rather, this is a way of being with them. It's true that the mysticism that the Sufis aspire to isn't for everyone, and nor are the dances of universal peace for everyone. They are just one practice. It is not the way, it's not the way, it is one way. There are mystics in all peoples, all cultures of the world, and there is a mystical side to all of the world's spiritual traditions. Mysticism does not come from the East or from the West. It is a human inheritance. It is timeless and it belongs to the soul. The spiritual traditions of the world, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, native cultures, all have a mystical aspect at their core. Or perhaps you've heard it expressed in this way in terms of Unitarian Universalism. From the sources of Unitarian Universalism, same quote that Emily just read. Direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder, affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. It is true that some mystics will choose to live alone as ascetics, secluded, away from the world. This is perhaps a common image of the life that a mystic leads, but it is not the only life that a mystic can lead. In fact, there are certainly many men and women who are quietly leading a life of mysticism in every country and in every culture. For these mystics, there need not be a divergence between their spirituality or mysticism and social or political justice and activism. So for a mystic, there doesn't need to be that disengagement that sometimes we feel, that Emily was talking about. Throughout history, mystics, and Sufis in particular, have been very involved in the affairs of the world. They have been known for their openness and acceptance, striving for social justice and involved in social action. In my Sufi tradition alone, there are a number of people who have done a variety of things to further the causes of justice, freedom, and ecology. One example I want to give is the daughter of Hazrat Inayat Khan, the man who brought universal Sufism from India to the West in the early part of the 19th century. His daughter, her name was Nuranisa Inayat Khan. And during World War II, Nuranisa volunteered for the British intelligence service. And she was smuggled into France to relay to the British movements of the Germans. She was later caught, she was soon caught by the Germans, the Nazis, and she was put to death. But she was one who had lived her whole life as the daughter of a mystic, and yet decided that she needed to step up and be active, and it cost her her life. As I get older, I am discovering that the direct experience of mysticism through dances and walks, through music, through prayer and meditative practices, by being in and connecting with nature, and through relationships, that I am being asked to return again and again to my authentic self. Through these channels and practices, one gets a glimpse of life through the lens of the mystic. Mystics have a filter that sees life through the qualities of gratitude, love, and compassion. As one very wise minister put it recently, love as a discipline, love as an ethic, and love as a commitment. It's your minister who said that. As I shed part of my identity with age, I am constantly discovering and rediscovering who I am. There is a constant digging, as it were, or as Emily put it, the lifting of the veils to get closer to the heart center. This can be difficult, even painful at times. But at the same time, the fact of being on the path is very liberating, and is in many ways, in and of itself, the goal. If I can be on this path with an awareness and with gratitude, and always remember, as Hazrat Inayat Khan wrote, and I quote, digging constantly in that holy land, which is the heart of man, the heart of woman, the first and last lesson is love. The first and last lesson in love is, I am not, thou art. And unless one is moved to that selflessness, he or she does not know justice, right, or truth. Thank you.